Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome. My computer says 5:30, so let's do a little technology check to begin here. If your technology is working, you should be able to see me, and you should hear me, and you should also be able to see a PowerPoint slide that I just put a yellow line in. So assuming all three of those are working for you, things are looking up for you. Hopefully you're having a good week. I'm not feeling all that well right now, so we'll see how effective I am here. I have to suck it up tonight. I'm just not feeling very well. I'm tired. I don't know. It's just blah. But anyway, the evening is ready to queue up here. Here's our agenda. We're going to go ahead and get right into some content. Last week we just really kind of used it as a practice session. We're going to get into content certainly with these first two areas. Take another look at the norms, exact same list we had from last week. We'll do a breakout session that will check your understanding on this first concept. As I mentioned last week, we'd spend some time tonight on the syllabus because we really didn't do that last night. So I picked out some items I want to point out to you. Certainly, if you have questions about anything, you'll have a chance to do that. We need to have some discussion about assignments and projects, so that'll be one of the latter things to do. That'll be actually the last items on my prepared agenda, and then we can end with your questions. So again, just in terms of formatting, my preference during these first couple of sessions is that if you have questions, that you type them. It seems to work more efficiently because sometimes microphones work or don't work, and it seems to kind of waste a lot of time if we have to stop during some of the presentation of material to allow students to have oral questions. When we get down to this part, you can ask away with your microphone. So I guess there's a couple of ways to ask questions in here, but I think it tends to be a little more efficient if we just have you type questions when I have some comments to make. And also, I tend to try to make myself pause every couple of slides just to see, so we won't leave anybody behind. So I like to have a good pace and keep us moving, but at the same time, if you're not following, I'm not leading. So we will, try to have a reasonable pace when we look at things. So those are the areas that I would propose constitute our agenda for this evening, and thank the couple of you who extended your sympathy to me. The rest of you, I guess, don't really care about your grade or doing well in this course, huh? Looks like only Pammy and Melissa. See, I'm feeling better already if I came up with a joke like that, right? Okay, I'm ready to jump in here, and so let's do it. First, throw content to discuss. There's about 5 bullets on this page. Let's allow me to make some comments about this. This is the context for school finance, a background. I don't know how much of this is new to you or old, so I guess we'll find out. But we have a federal governmental system in the United States, which essentially means we have a sharing of power between our 50 states and the federal government. Much of the disagreement and argument between political parties and between the House and the Senate and the President and the House often stems in terms of where we should draw this line in terms of what the federal government should be doing, what the states should be doing. But historically, it's been without question that education is the province or the responsibility of the states. We didn't even have a federal Department of Education, I believe, until the Jimmy Carter era. And it really was with World War II and the increasing size of the national government Sputnik when the Russians were in space before us, and it concerned that our education system was failing, and we were going to lose the Cold War to the Russians because of a bad education system. Those kind of events precipitated an increasing role for the federal government, and we have federal legislation for students with disabilities, the handicapping legislation, the access legislation. Those are all examples of an increasing role of the federal government in education, but that's still, I think, without question and without debate in nearly everybody's mind that education is the responsibility of the state. So the importance for us in this context is every state then, therefore, must create its own financing system within that state. So what we have in Georgia is not necessarily what they have in South Carolina. And what they have in Rhode Island is not necessarily what they have in Maine. So the point is that those are decisions that are made at the state level, most often by state legislators, but sometimes state courts become involved. So that's, I guess, point number one. You need to understand that and recognize finance is going to vary from state to state, primarily because education is the responsibility of the state. And every state comes up with its own method to fund education. So point number two, there are commonalities, there are similarities among states, but yet there also are distinctions by state. And not surprisingly, because legislators or elected political officials, there obviously are differences based sometimes on politics in terms of somebody got elected promising all-day kindergarten, just as a for example. So then you try to get all-day kindergarten in your funding system. Some states are hurt worse by the economic bad years we've had the last 5, 6, 7 years, however many years it's been now. It seems to never going to go away. But some states are hit worse, so they have to do different kinds of things in their funding than other states do. But there is no question, point three, I think I've already made this point, the federal role has been increasing really since World War II. I don't personally think that's good, but that's my opinion, and I probably shouldn't have made that statement. But there's no doubt that the federal role is growing. Those of you that are working in Title I schools, there's an example of a federal role in funding of education. That's been since the 1960s that we have the federal government providing billions of dollars each year to states, and then states parcel that out to the local districts. Fourth point, need to keep this one right up in the front of your mind, because a lot of this course centers on how we address this issue of property taxes. But nearly every state, with the exception of about 3 or 4, use some type of a property tax as a key funder for schools. Property taxes are often referred to as the school taxes because they are typically used to fund the operations of local government like towns and counties, and schools are also considered a local governmental entity in many states. So keep this kind of up in the front of your head, that property taxes are often equated as being called the school taxes, and that creates a lot of challenges in states, and something we'll see in just a moment. Well, and I'm saying it here in the last bullet, I think everybody in this class is from Georgia, so you can envision, if you just get in your car and drive around Georgia, you can see that our wealth within the state is not equally distributed in all counties and in all school systems. Some counties, like Fulton County, we'll pick on Fulton right now, are much more wealthy than the rest of the state of Georgia. So when you use a property tax and you have wealth that's not distributed equally, in other words, we have inequities in our distribution of property wealth, this creates significant challenges for a state to figure out a a fair way, and everybody has their own definition of fair, but it creates a very serious and significant challenge to determine how to deal with these so-called, not so-called, they are inequities in the distribution of wealth throughout a state. So I'll do my first pause here because I see a couple comments before we go to the next slide. But that is the context to kind of keep in mind as the backdrop to school finance. QBE was, in fact, QBE is our Georgia State Quality Basic Education Program. Our state funding program was designed in part to deal with inequity. That's exactly correct. Critics would argue it didn't go far enough, it hasn't done enough, it hasn't been funded enough. Not seeing another question. Let me go ahead to, I do see another question now. I'll hold my next slide. Do Atlanta residents pay city property tax and county property taxes? Yes, they do. And they pay city school taxes. So if you live in an incorporated area of Georgia, meaning you live like in a city, you're paying a city tax, a county tax, and a school tax. So your taxes are higher than the rest of us who live in an unincorporated part of Georgia. I live in a rural area of Douglas County, so I pay only Douglas County school taxes and Douglas County taxes. I don't have to pay taxes for Douglasville. I think QBE maybe was fully funded the first 2 years. It goes back to 1985, but certainly not in recent years. It has not been funded and to what would be the legislatively identified full funding level. And that started, well, I don't even know the exact year that it started, but you've heard of the so-called austerity cuts. The reality is, and we certainly will be getting to this in the next module, but the reality is the state of Georgia must have a balanced budget. And we all know that unfortunately our federal government is, I believe, almost $17 trillion in debt right now. And we don't have a requirement for our federal government to have a balanced budget, but the state of Georgia must have a balanced budget. So unlike the federal government, which just prints more money and deficit spends, the state of Georgia cannot do that. The governor can't just crank out a printing press in his office and send money to the schools. They can only send what they've collected through property taxes, or not through property taxes, through sales tax and income tax. So my point in sharing that is not to sympathize with the governor, although maybe we should. The reality is it's a very different dynamic. The legislature cannot spend what it doesn't have. So, and I see another comment. I've been told that parts of Fulton and DeKalb counties in the city of Atlanta receive funding. That's also true. Yes, that is true. Atlanta Public Schools is actually in DeKalb County also. I mean, I don't understand all those relationships in the metro area, but there are some interesting boundaries that are there. Like, for example, APS is not just Fulton County. It also draws in a part of DeKalb County. So let me move ahead if you're still with me. Okay, if you don't get anything else out of these 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes that I'm going to be talking this evening, tune into this slide, okay? This slide will explain to you a lot of the background as to why school finance seems to be more complicated than it needs to be. So let's look at what we have here. I'm trying to demonstrate that when you use a property tax, and nearly every state uses a property tax, including Georgia, when you use a property tax, you potentially have real questions of inequity. And I've tried to illustrate that with two hypothetical districts, school districts. We have District A and we have District B. They both have the exact same number of kids. So we can assume that they have about the same number of expenses. They need the same number of teachers. the same number of buildings, within reason, but we're talking about a district that's basically comparing apples to apples here. And for the purposes of this example, we're assuming that they set their property tax and the school board decides what the levy is for the school property taxes. So we're just assuming for our sake right now that they have set that at 0.01, which is actually, I think that's 10%. I'm not a good mathematician, but so the point is they have the same number of kids, they have the same tax rate. So their effort, the amount of taxes they're putting on themselves to pay for their schools is exactly the same. They're giving the same effort. Here's where we have a difference. District A, the tax digest, is the value of all the real and the personal property that's located in that school district. That's what gets taxed. Buildings, cars, business inventory, land, homes, etc. That's the real and personal property that gets taxed. And for the purposes of this example, District A, their property values are $1 million, and District B is not as wealthy. The value of their property in their district is only $100,000. So the point is, look at what the outcome is. When you take the tax digest and multiply it by the rate, District A has $10,000 available to spend for its schools, and District B, when you take their tax digest, which only consists of $100,000 and multiply by the same 10% rate, they only have $1,000 available to support their students. So this is a problem, this is a challenge on what to do about this. If we want to put names with this, just for example, we could say, this is Fulton County sitting there with $10,000, and District B will just pick on Jenkins County, one of our downstate counties. This is Jenkins County trying just as hard as Fulton County because they're taxing themselves at the same rate as Fulton County, but they're not getting the same result because it's not a level playing field. 10% of $100,000 is a lot less than 10% of $1 million. So the whole point is what is the state going to do about this? If we're going to use property taxes to fund our schools, and we use them in Georgia, and the point is the school boards like it because it gives them some control and some say-so. All the money's not coming from Atlanta. Part of it gets to be decided locally through these property taxes. So the schools don't want to give the property taxes up. But the problem is, what does the state do about this? And how do you make District A feel good about it? Because at the end of the day, District A, too, is probably going to have to give up some of their money and send it over to District B. So a lot of what school finance is and a lot of the complications and things that don't seem very obvious and seem convoluted are really going about addressing this issue. So let me pause here. This is big. You need to get a mental wrap around this and why this is a real challenge. You might say, just get rid of the property tax. You could do that. But again, property taxes have a long history in many states as funding schools. The Georgia School Boards Association doesn't want to get rid of the property taxes. School board members don't want to get rid of them. It gives a lot of local control to local folks, and they like that. So then the question becomes, can the state step in? And if the state steps in, where does the state get the funding to step in from? Well, they probably take some of District A funding and send it over here to District B, and that's what some states do. And obviously, when you have this being made, this decision being made in a political environment, you have to have votes in order to get things done. So obviously the people who are advantaged from this system like, let's just pick on Fulton County again, like a Fulton County, a Cobb County, they aren't necessarily going to be jumping up and down, wanting to push their money down, really in Georgia, most of it downstate to the poorer parts of the state. So we good on this? Can we get a thumbs up that you get the concept behind this and why this is really a thumb up? No middle fingers, only thumbs. This is an important conceptual piece. I just have a couple more slides. I want to throw some content at you now. What I want to throw at you is this concept of a meta value. It's another related piece to why school funding and school finance seems to be kind of a mess, and we don't seem to sometimes be able to agree. I am arguing in part because there are at least 4 meta values that sometimes are in competition with one another, that when men and women who are responsible for making these decisions get together, they each bring to the conversation a set of values and principles, and sometimes those are incongruent. Sometimes they're incompatible values and objectives. So let me slip forward one slide and then back to this. So the meta values I'm calling are set of principles, beliefs, and values. So again, we're talking, this is school finance. So really, what is in people's minds, and we're really talking about the General Assembly, but also people, educational leaders, all have their own sets of beliefs about what's fair and what's not fair with respect to school funding. So those beliefs, those values, those principles, I'm calling them meta values. They may also be viewed as the norms. These are distinct. Let me go back to my previous. These are different. Liberty is different than adequacy, which is different than equality and equity. There are 4 distinct, different values. However, they are very similar. There's some overlap, and sometimes an effort could be both an example of adequacy and equity. Sometimes they are more than distinct. Sometimes they are the same. So they are related concepts, but they may also come in conflict during implementation. And I think as we work our way through school finance, you're going to see them as easy to identify in terms of when something is done or we're describing something. I think you're easily going to be able to say, oh, that's an example of the liberty value. So let's take a moment, go back and try to define these. I have a couple of resources posted on these. We're going to take another bite out of the apple on this in the future. Our breakout session tonight is to check for your understanding of these, but let me have my 3 minutes to define these. Let me start with the easiest one. Let me start in this lower right quadrant. What's equality? Well, an easy way to start on that is to think in terms of like the civil rights movement and a desire for equal treatment of all Americans without respect to their ethnicity, their race. Equality, by its very nature, if you look it up in the Webster Dictionary, I think you're going to find it means the same, or it means an equal portion, or it means consistent. So in school funding or school finance, if you hear somebody advocating for funding that's parceled out equally, same chunk, let's say every kindergartner gets $1,000 without respect to whether they're in Jenkins County or Fulton County, that would be an example of somebody expressing a desire for equality in school funding. Consistent, same, equal portion of funding, equality. Let me go to equity, which is often confused with equality. Equity goes further than equality. Equity is actually unequal treatment. And I think the easiest way to conceive of equity is to think about certain segments of students who most of us would agree are more at risk for being successful in school, or in the case of, say, a student with disabilities, let's say a blind student, that student would need more resources to have an opportunity to benefit from education as compared to a general education student. So what equity does is go beyond giving equal funding. Equity gives more funding, additional funding, to targeted students that appear to be at risk or who are behind their peers. We give Title I funding would be an example, I would argue, of equity. In order to receive Title I funding, you have to have a certain amount of poverty. So the logic is that students who are in poverty start out behind, so therefore we need to provide extra funding to offset the differences brought about by poverty. So Title I would argue, is a fund that would be giving us equity. We get more special education funding for students with severe disabilities than a general education student. That would be an example of equity in funding. EIP is equity. You are identifying or targeting certain students who seem, if we don't give them the extra booster shot, the extra funding, we are assuming they'll be much less likely to make it. So equity goes way beyond an equal portion. Equity is unequal treatment of unequals. You find unequals, general ed, special ed student, and you treat them unequally in how you distribute the funds. That's equity by my pure definition. Liberty is traceable back to the founding of this country. Give me liberty, give me death. Revolutionary War. British taxed us without having us, letting us have representation. We didn't like that. Liberty is this whole notion of self-determination, self-control, allowing, in this case, local school boards and local administrators to have more say-so in the schools. That would be an example of liberty. And in school finance, an example of liberty would be allowing the local school boards to have property taxes and to set the property tax rates. Those are set at the school board level. Every school board in the state of Georgia sets their own property tax rates for schools. Those are examples of liberty. It's local control. The decision's not made in Atlanta. It's made all across the state, in Macon, in Columbus, in Valdosta, in Atlanta. It's made by local folks who live in that community, and that's the whole logic behind it. If you're going to tax the people in an area, they should be represented by elected people, their school board, that decides what's a reasonable amount of taxation for the schools. So liberty is the whole idea of self-determination, self-control as far as funding for schools. And then adequacy, I'm sure you all know what that word means at its root, but in this case of school finance, I think an example will help on this. Many people have said No Child Left Behind failed because it was never funded adequately. So adequate would be enough funding provided to meet a certain outcome. And we know the outcomes of No Child Left Behind were that I think we're supposed to be at 100% proficiency by this year, weren't we? Isn't that what it was? And you might say that that because No Child Left Behind was inadequately funded, there was never enough money provided to get us to 100% proficiency. But inadequacy, the really hard concept, is to try to figure out how much money is enough to be adequate. I mean, let me take a pause here. I'm talking too much and making you listen. I'm sorry. And I'm get too excited when I talk about this stuff. So I'm taking a chill pill right now. But let's take a thought about this for a minute. If our goal is to graduate everybody in Georgia, let's just say the goal is everybody in Georgia graduates from high school. Right now we're at probably what? I don't even know what it is, 70%. Some number like that, 70% of the kids now graduate. For us to get to 100% of kids in Georgia graduating high school, how much money would be necessary to adequately fund that? Can you put a dollar amount on that? I don't know how to do that. But that's really what sometimes happens in some of these cases that end up in courts when a state gets sued for inadequately funding education, and then you have a judge or somebody trying to figure out, well, how much money should it really have been? If Georgia's spending $3 billion right now, and we're getting 70%, does that mean we need to spend $5 billion? Or do we need to spend $6 billion? Or, as Gene's comment here, like in Kentucky, where the entire educational system was declared unconstitutional and the state was essentially mandated to rebuild its entire educational system. But the point is, it's not very easy to come up with a number or even a process to determine how you would figure out what a number would be in terms of how much is enough to be adequate. So let me make one point. These two, liberty and equity, are the two that most of the time are in conflict. It's usually these two that can't get along. Because when you raise equity, most of the time when you raise equity, you're decreasing liberty most of the time. These are the two where there's a lot of tension. Because if you are raising equity, most of the time what that means is the state is stepping in and doing more. And if the state is stepping in and doing more, that means they're taking away from the local control. So these are the ones that don't play nice most of the time. These are the two that typically are in conflict. And just one more hint. These two, equity and adequacy, are very similar concepts and often confused by students. I make the distinction that adequacy is tied to a specific outcome, like in the example I gave, like the no child left behind outcome that we're going to get to 100% proficiency. So if you see a specific outcome like we need to fund schools more in order to increase the graduation rate, I think that most likely is somebody expressing an adequacy value as compared to somebody just saying we need to fund blind students more because they need more services. So, what do you say here? Good? We move forward? I see Dawn's comment or question. I think that might be one way to look at it. But again, it's how much would you need to get to attain a certain outcome. I'll pause to see if there's any more commentary. Gene's on target. I think that's really what we're seeing a lot more lately are court arguments about adequacy, no doubt about it. And in Georgia, adequacy is particularly important because that word is actually in our Georgia Constitution. So the General Assembly of Georgia really can't run and hide from that. They've got to demonstrate that they are, in fact, funding at what would reasonably be interpreted an adequate level because the Georgia Constitution commands it. But there is no question that the more recent cases that end up in court, that adequacy arguments are the ones that are winning the day more than other kinds of legal arguments. I guess Jennifer's going to have a that may be true, Andrea. That's a good way to think of it, because I think that is probably true. But some people think you can sit down and actually put a dollar amount to these things. You know, if you want to get to 100% and we're at 70% now and we're spending X amount, that you can somehow quantify that. I guess you probably can. I don't know how accurate it is, but okay, I see a question about carryover funds. I'm assuming you're talking about like from one fiscal year to the next funds that were not completely expended. Most of that is governed by either rules from the state in terms of whether you can carry over money. If it's from a grant, Some grants require you to return the money and you can't carry it over. But to be honest about it, too, a lot of the school finance departments in your districts, they don't want to carry over funds. They like to sweep the funds, because if you sweep the funds, you're increasing the cash balance. We're going to get to that. That's one of our last modules. That's really kind of an accounting question. That was probably, I mean, these may be local district decisions about how that's done. I can't really comment beyond that unless I knew the actual facts. It does depend on the source, whether you can carry it over or not, and whether you have the latitude to how to redistribute it. I'm sorry I can't respond better at this point. Can we, again, I don't want to cut anybody off, but can we move forward? I don't know that I actually addressed it well. I got 2 more slides, if you'll stick with me, and then I'll be done with my 3 more slides. I'll be done with my missive for the night. So again, this should be evident to you that how to deal with those inequities. And I'm going back again. Let me give you a headache here. Back to this slide. These are the inequities I'm talking about. How we deal with this. Oops. There are certainly differences within states on how to deal with that, and there also are the arguments between those expressing liberty values and those expressing equity values or equity issues. Those are major friction points in school finance. We'll continue to develop these, so these are not going away. These are not one and done. But the fact is that the state legislature and sometimes the courts intervene, but each state creates its own system. That's all review. We've got that now. So let me throw one more set of information at you. We're going to take several bites out of this apple, not just tonight. I'll give you a smiley face on this. You need it on this. So again, as I said, states decide how they want to fund their schools. This is a continuum. In the next slide, I've made it more like a continuum. But all the 50 states are somewhere on this line in terms of using a funding program that relies more on flat grants or what we call a foundation plan. I know these terms are new to you. Or something that looks more like a power equalization plan. And again, I know these are new to you. And then there are a couple of states, actually 3, Hawaii for sure, maybe Vermont, maybe Washington, that have pretty much gone away from the property tax part and the local liberty control part, and the state is pretty much funding education fully in those states. So again, back to our other graphic, this is something we need to get emblazoned in our brain in this course. I'm not expecting you to have it emblazoned tonight, but certainly you should be able to find every state in the United States somewhere along this line. Georgia has a foundation program. I know that doesn't mean anything to you right now. There are a few states that are over here with a power equalization kind of a program. North Carolina still has some flat granting, but most states are somewhere kind of here in the middle. But the point is that that's kind of the middle road between the liberty and the equity, because if you get to this side of the models, you really have more equity on this side, and on this side you have more liberty. And there's probably less involvement from the state on these sides and more involvement from the state over here. Georgia's in the middle. We have a compromise kind of both sides. We have liberty, we have equity in our system. So there are several items that I have posted that have to do with these different state funding models. We're going to kick this around and around and around for several weeks because I think it's important for you to understand that these are decisions made at the state level, and there are a lot of options that states have in terms of how they want to distribute the funding for their schools. But just to make one more point, and then we won't go any further on this tonight. The Georgia model, the foundation model, there's a certain amount of funding that's guaranteed to everybody, and then there are other provisions that kick in that provide extra funding to the poorest districts in the state. So it has both the liberty component, because we have local school boards deciding local tax rates and what to do with their local funds, but yet we also have equity, because we have the state of Georgia kicking in and providing extra money trying to deal with this situation we talked about earlier. What Georgia does is they rank the wealth of the districts and they try to supplement this poor District B over here with some extra money from the state. Now, critics will say, rightfully, it never gets fully funded, they don't fund it enough, it's not doing enough, but the point is we do have what would be called a foundation program. We have a certain dollar foundation amount established that everybody gets at least that much because the state guarantees it. So I think that's enough for tonight, other than to say to you, I've got several documents posted where I've tried to describe what these things are. I would strongly suggest you spend some time, carve out some time, and take a look at these. The tax anticipation note, I see a question there. A lot of times you have bills to pay and people need to be paid before the property tax dollars come in. So you borrow money from some financial institution in anticipation of your tax money coming in. So let's say your tax monies come in December, but you may need money in October. So you have to borrow money in October that you pay back in December when your tax dollars actually come in. Unfortunately, the cycle of when we receive revenue doesn't always match up with when we have expenses to pay. So systems have to do, some systems have to do tax anticipation notes. And of course they don't like to do them because they have, it's a lot of paperwork, number one, but number two, they have to pay interest to the bank or to whatever institution that they are borrowing the money from. So it's essentially costing them money off the top. But everybody wants to be paid, right? So that's what you have to do. So again, my last comment, again, think of this as a continuum. All the 50 states are somewhere on here. Georgia's probably right about where I have my check right now. Hawaii's over here. These are local decisions made within the states regarding what kind of system they want to develop in order to fund financially and support their schools. So